So January in my home is reading month, for sure. It is that time where you curl up with a good book. And I've hit a book this January. Have you guys ever read one of those books that it's hard to read, but you actually can't stop turning the pages? That's the kind of book that I read this month. And oh my gosh, like it had human sex trafficking, crazy amount of alcohol abuse and addiction. It had unmitigated misogynistic practice of women. It had a scheme of genocide and an assassination attempt. I mean, it was a page turner. It was hard to read. Now I know you're thinking, which New York Times bestseller is she referring to? Because it's topics that are so current and relevant for us today. But actually, I was reading from a book in the Old Testament. And Pastor Mark has been doing an amazing job of laying the foundation of vision for us for this year. Joel 2:32 says, "And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." That's a bold proclamation. He's also laid it out for us in such a beautiful way that Winnipeg belongs to Jesus. Yeah. When we make those proclamations, when we make those declarations, there's going to be pushback. There just is. And it's not about if or when, but now. Trouble's going to come. That's how it rolls. And we live in a fallen world. We know that. The story that I want us to talk about today is found in the book of Esther. And actually, there's 10 chapters, but no worries. We're not going to hit 10 chapters. But one of the arcing thoughts about this book is for such a time as this. And I want to suggest to us this morning that we are living in such a time as this. I want us to pull a few things out of the Esther story and see how it can apply for us as we deal with some of our own battles. If we can pull some of the truths that we found in how they dealt with their such a time, maybe it can help us deal with our such a time. You know, Jesus described our enemy like a thief. In John 10:10, he says, "The thief comes to kill, to steal, and to destroy. But I have come that it would have life and have it abundantly." We want to be aware. We don't want to be caught not being aware that there's going to be some pushback. Now, I'm going to jump into the 4th chapter of the book, and I already told you, it's a page turner. Those of you that aren't familiar with the book, I want to give you just a little bit of background. The book of Esther was not, even though it sounded like it was written in 2024, it was written in approximately 475 BC. And it takes place in the empire of Persia. And it's a vast empire, literally stretching 127 provinces from India all the way to the boundary lines of Kush, which is modern-day Palestine. Massive, the largest empire of the time. And there's 4 main characters that we're going to touch on today. One is the king of that empire, King Xerxes. So that's one. The other is the antagonist in the story, and he is someone who his heart was set against God's people. His name was Haman, and he was second in command in the kingdom. And then we got the cousins. We have Mordecai and his little cousin Esther. And Mordecai actually took Esther in when she was a small child because her parents died, leaving her an orphan, and Mordecai raised Esther as his own. By the time we jump into the story, the scripture that we're going to be talking about this morning, by the time we jump into the story, a couple things have already happened. Let's see. There's been a beauty pageant, and Esther won that beauty pageant and was crowned queen. Mordecai is Haman is now second in command. And early on in Queen Esther's reign, Mordecai stumbled upon an assassination attempt on King Xerxes, and he foiled that attempt, saving King Xerxes' life. And the Bible tells us that that occurrence was documented in the Chronicles for the king's safekeeping. That's some of what has gone on. The other, and I mentioned already, that Haman absolutely despises God's people, but more so than anyone else, he despises Mordecai because Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman. And so, on one of the many nights of drinking and hanging out, Haman plots and schemes, and he gets the signet ring off the king's. Well, the king offers it to him as Haman begins to plot taking out God's people. And the king really actually just loves to party. That's his MO. As a matter of fact, when the book opens, there's been a party running for like 6 months, all in favor of the king. So we got some narcissism happening here. But during this drinking night, Haman begins to, and racism is so prevalent through this book, but he begins to say, we don't need these people. They're different than us. Honestly, you're better off without them. And King Xerxes, really, he's just looking from one party to the next, and he just doesn't want to do anything. But he says, here, take my ring. And that signet ring is power. That signet ring would seal the deal of anything that is written. That signet ring would say, it has now become a law, irrefutable law. So much so that even the king could not turn that law over. So he gives Haman that ring. And Haman makes a decree. And for Haman, it's a game. He literally rolls some dice and to decide, what day would I like to kill all of God's people? Oh, and what month and what day? He rolls the dice to figure that out. He gets the date, he gets the month, and then he makes a decree. And it goes out to all 127 provinces that on this month, on that day, all of God's people are fair game. And not just to kill them, but then to take all of their loot, all of their possessions. It's devastating. This is a very violent time, but the Bible tells us that the people of Susa, the capital city of the Persian Empire, that even the people in Susa who are used to violence, extreme, were bewildered at this horrific decree. And yet, it also tells us that Haman and King Xerxes just kept drinking. That's kind of where we come into the story. And the scripture is found in the 4th chapter, verses 12 to 17. When Esther's words, let me just say this. Mordecai has sent a directive to Esther in the palace, because she's now the queen. And he sent a directive saying, you've got to petition, you've got to plead for the lives of our people. And Esther has come back to Mordecai and said, hold up. I don't know if you know this or not, but if I go to the king without being summoned, automatic grounds to be killed on the spot. So we got to figure something else out. And this is Mordecai's response. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that you do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast and pray for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. We want to pull from this. I want to touch on 3 things. I want to talk about how in calamity and crisis, sometimes there is incredible clarity that comes. I want to talk about how there are absolutely no coincidences in God's economy. And I want to pull some conclusions from this book that we can appropriate, hopefully, to our lives today. So, Esther initially gives some pushback. But then when Mordecai says, hey, maybe for such a time as this, you've been called. I love what Esther does in her response. So Mordecai gives the pushback and says, this is real, this is happening, this is going down, and the death of our people can happen. But Mordecai also reminds her that there's one greater, and that even though she's in a position of prestige, that she's tucked into a palace, that at the end of the day, God is still the author and the finisher of their lives. And so, what's really cool is how Esther responds. I love that she moves right into action. The Bible tells us that Esther, besides being drop-dead gorgeous, that she had a spirit about her that everybody loved her. And she's been queen now for over 5 years. She could have taken this battle, and she could have taken it into the physical realm. She could have begun to figure out, who are my allies? Who do I need to find here? She could have taken it and said, hey, let's go and fight this on a political front. Let's begin to make connections. But she doesn't. She takes the battle from the physical realm into the spiritual realm right away. It goes from the ground into the air. But this is what's interesting. A lot of us Christians understand that language. We understand about being in a spiritual battle. Often, we default to a passive stance. We default to that position of, I'm being attacked. Oh, it's January. My finances are being attacked right now. It's not great. And we think that that's it. That's we declare it, and yeah, it sucks to be us. But the reality is that there's another side to that. There's our part in that battle. Sometimes when we're struggling with something like finances, we have to be really honest and reflective with our Creator about maybe what we're doing with Amazon Prime or how much time we're spending on Facebook Marketplace. Hey, I'm preaching to my own choir about that. Trust me. But Esther did not take that as a passive stance. She went into solution-focused action and said, let's do some prayer and fasting. There's a clarity that can come to us in that moment when a crisis or calamity hits, where we have a choice of what we want to do with that. I love that Esther did not spend a lot of time lamenting. She did not spend a lot of time on why. Why is this happening to us? Why is this happening to my people? I was in this amazing spot. I had the Hallmark ending. How can this be happening? No. She went right into, I am going to pray and I'm going to fast with my handmaidens. Mordecai, if you could get all the God's people in this capital city of Susa and to do the same for 3 days and for 3 nights. When we do prayer and fasting, it is not passive. That is an action step. And so what does that do? What does fasting do? Fasting is a posture. Let me just try that again. Fasting is a surrender. It says, wow, this is big. This is even bigger than me. And I need you, God, and I invite you to come and partner with me in this. And that is exactly what Esther did. She and Mordecai, they fasted for 3 days and for 3 nights. And there was a humbling that happens in that process, an opening. 2 Chronicles 7:14 says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. That is the warfare that Esther and Mordecai took from the ground into the spiritual realm. And Haman, he didn't know what was coming. He did not know what was coming. And so Esther prays and fasts for 3 days and 3 nights, and then the Bible tells us she dons her royal robes and she goes to the palace. And it's interesting, it doesn't say that there was fear and trembling. It doesn't say that she was weeping loudly, but there was a poise and a calm. The Bible calls it a peace that makes no earthly sense. That as she is partnering with God, there is a peace that makes no earthly sense. And she approaches King Xerxes, and he does extend the golden scepter and asks her what she would like. The clock is ticking. There is a date for the annihilation of her people. And she throws herself at his feet, and begs and pleads and cries, and that doesn't happen. She calmly invites him to a banquet. And she says, would you and Haman please come to a banquet that I shall prepare for you tonight in your honor? I mean, I don't know about you, but when I'm going through a crisis, I'm not thinking about preparing a banquet, but man, incredible wisdom. Because if there's one thing she had picked up that these guys threw down all the time is they love to eat and they love to drink. So, I mean, there's a lot of wisdom in her strategizing here. And so the first banquet happens. They're wined and they are dined. And now the king, he said, hey, we what did they say? The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So she's nailed that, and he's feeling really generous. And he says, Esther, my queen, what can I do for you? Suspense is building in the story. And again, I mean, Esther is literally dining with Haman. She is sitting at a banquet in the presence of her enemies. I don't know if there's anyone here today that is facing an enemy, that's going through a season of hard. But it's interesting that God invites us to sit in the presence of our enemies. Sometimes what we go through, you know what? It's a sprint. It's awesome. It's an event. But sometimes it's a marathon. And we got to eat and we got to be strong. How do we stay strong when we're going through a hard? How? We got to eat. We got to spend time worshiping a God who's bigger than the hard that we're facing, that we're walking through. We have to spend time literally eating God's word, being fed. Sometimes we do the if and when then. When this is over, then I'll get into this whole church thing. When this is past and behind me. But in this, we see Esther literally dining in the presence of her enemies. You know, nothing had changed. Haman still had a target on her back and on the backs of all of God's people. But everything had changed for Esther in the spiritual realm. And so here we are at this first banquet. And again, the king is saying, my queen, what can I do for you? What is it that I can do for you? I mean, he's loving all the TLC. And she says, if it would please you, if you could please come to a second banquet tomorrow that I will host in your honor. And now at this point, as I'm reading it, I'm like, what? Like, why would you delay this and suspend the deliverance of your people? And the Bible does not give us a reason, not a tangible reason, as to why Esther suspends the request of the deliverance of her people. But the king concedes, and Haman, he's feeling pretty full of himself. They're in for the next night. And okay, so that night, the night in between the first banquet and the second banquet, a few things happen. First, Haman, who is completely full of himself, as he's going home from the banquet, he runs into Mordecai, and he is spurred with a fresh batch of hatred and resentment, and he decides, no, he's not going to wait for that date and that month. No, he needs to take Mordecai out now. He goes home, he confers with all of his yes people, and they're like, yeah, absolutely, you should do this. And he begins that night, he gets his people on it right away to erect a 75-foot scaffolding, of which he plans the very next day to impale Mordecai. So that's going on in Haman's world. King Xerxes, he's got a different vibe going on in the palace. He is hit with a massive case of insomnia. He cannot sleep. And so he figures, what's the best reading that's going to cause a massive snooze fest is the chronicles of the happenings in the kingdom. Like, come read me some minutes of what's been going on. That'll do the trick. And so he gets an attendant to begin to read to him. And the attendant reads to him of the incident that happened 5 years prior. Remember when Mordecai foiled the assassination attempt on his life? And so he says to the attendant, hey, did we ever do anything for that guy? And the attendant says, nope. He's thinking about this. I just want to pause for a second and think about Mordecai in that story, having done something so well done in saving King Xerxes' life. He did the right thing, and nothing, crickets on that issue for not just months, but years. I don't know if there's any of us having a Mordecai moment ourselves where we've been doing so much of the right thing. We've been working hard. We've been tithing. We've been coming to church. We've been doing it all. We are waiting for something. And God would say to us this morning, I see you. Sometimes, we do that where we've done the right things for all the right reasons, and it's still not going for us. It's going for everybody else, but it's not happening for us. Oh man, I've been there. And God would say to us this morning, I see you. I see you. I have not forgotten. I don't forget. I'm on it. I'm here with you. I'm in it. So the king has insomnia, and he's thinking about this Mordecai guy who saved his life. Well, morning dawns, and it just so happens that Haman is got a zing in his step because he is ready to ask King Xerxes if he can just get Mordecai executed quick today. He's on his way to ask him that, heading into the palace, when he meets King Xerxes, who says, Haman, I got a question for you. Haman's like, yeah. If you wanted to, pay honor to someone who's pretty great, what would you suggest? And remember, Haman's all about me, myself, and I. He's like, this is about me. This is all about me. And so Haman concocts an elaborate, there should be a parade. There should be royal horses. There should be royal robes worn. And there should be someone leading it through and saying, this guy's amazing. And he is thinking, he's salivating. This isn't going to be incredible for him. He can't barely wait. And the King Xerxes says, that is great. As a matter of fact, because remember, King Xerxes, he's pretty lazy. He doesn't want to actually do anything. And he says, that's such a good idea. Haman, that is brilliant. Why don't you do that for me? You lead and orchestrate this whole thing for a guy called Mordecai. Plot twist, right? Plot twist. You guys, God's got some plot twists for us in this room today. There are some plot twists coming. Some of us have been walking. Some of us have been tarrying. Some of us have been pushing hard, doing all the right things. God sees you. God sees you. God hears you. God's got you in the palm of his hand. So we got this plot twist. But for Queen Esther, for Mordecai, nothing has really changed. As a matter of fact, Haman, he's thinking there's something. Not feeling that great. But the Bible tells us that after the parade that is happening on the day of the second banquet, that Mordecai, he just goes back to work. Literally, what must have that felt like? I'm going to celebrate you. I am going to walk you through the city. We're going to have tambourines playing. We're going to trumpets blowing. You're going to wear the royal robes. Oh, but by the way, in a couple months, open season on you. You're gone. That's what he knows. It's got to be like cray-cray, right? I can't rap on that one. So Mordecai goes back to work. Talk about, the Brits have a saying, keep calm and carry on. Wow. Mordecai, he landed that. Haman, he's lamenting. He goes home and brings his yes people around and is like, I don't think this is good. We'll see. And then it's the night of the second banquet. This stretched out, drawn out process. And the second banquet, palace officials go and pick up Haman at his residence and take him to the banquet, and King Xerxes is there, and there's Esther, and the king's like, okay, I get it. You're sweetening me up for something. What up? What can I give you? Up to half my kingdom. It's a nice thing to say. I don't think that it was legit. But hey, he's like, offer her the world, and if she asks for, how kids, right? If you really want a pet hamster, start by asking for a horse, and then a dog, so this is a little bit of, but in reverse. What would you like? And it is here that Queen Esther pleads. She says, actually, I'd like you to spare my life and the life of my people. And the Bible tells us that as she explains, reminding the king of this edict that has gone out, the Bible says that King Xerxes storms out of the room. And it could be that he's trying to save face. It could be. Because, yes, I know he was doing a lot of drinking, but he did take off his signet ring and basically give Haman carte blanche on whatever he wanted to do with those people. And now King Xerxes finds himself in a bit of a twist. So he leaves the room. And when he leaves, Haman, of course, fearing for his life, rightly so, is pleading. And he goes and he invades Queen Esther's personal space, which is against the law in that time. And just as he's invading Queen Esther's personal space, pleading for his life, King Xerxes comes back into the room, and that seals the deal. And King Xerxes calls for the execution of Haman. Now, this is where I want to talk about a couple of the ironies that are huge in this story. But before that, wow, there's a lot of coincidences that had to happen in quick succession. The coincidence that Haman would have this 75-foot structure. The coincidence that Haman would be coming into the palace just as the king is contemplating rewarding this guy called Mordecai. And they would meet and have this conversation. The coincidence that it would be Haman leading Mordecai. The coincidence that King Xerxes would walk back in just as Haman is invading Esther's personal space. Coincidences. Coincidence that King Xerxes would have insomnia, and the coincidence that he would be reading and hearing, be read to about the incident that happened 5 years ago. Coincidences. Those things in our lives that happen where we go, I can't believe that happened. Those things that happen in our lives where we're like, I couldn't have planned that. That's crazy. Those coincidences, those God-ordained moments that I fear that in 2024, we blow by them. We don't see them. God is orchestrating. God is moving. God is active. God is pursuing. God is loving on. God is waiting. He's doing it. He's working. Do we see it? Do we acknowledge it? Do we catch those moments and say, wow, sometimes they're huge. They are so huge that even as we're telling the story, someone will say to us, that's crazy, right? When do we say, it's God. He loves me. Like Pastor David said, God really loves me. Yes. Yes, he does. He loves you. And he's working on your behalf. And there are so many coincidences every day. Glimmers. Sometimes they are small but so precious. That perfect timing, that phone call, that text, that encounter that you had, that moment. And God orchestrated it perfectly. Do we see it? Do we pick it up? Like in this story, there is no such thing as coincidences in God's economy. God is working. God is moving. God is for you. He's thinking. He's plotting and he's planning. And he will work despite us. That's what I love. Esther and Mordecai, they were not perfect. But man, boy, did God show up. And so we've got coincidences. We got crises. What are some of the conclusions that we can draw from this story? This Esther story found in the Old Testament. What are some of the things that we can conclude? I want to frame this conversation of conclusions with this question: who is the hero in this story? Who's the hero in this story? Well, a couple things. I mean, oh my gosh, I love Mordecai in this story. One of the things that humbles me and calls me higher about Mordecai is that he saw a need, he met the need, and he exceeded a need. Mordecai raised a child that wasn't his own. As someone who's adopted, I appreciate men and women who will take in a child, love a child that isn't their own. But Mordecai didn't just meet that need. He exceeded it. The Bible tells us that even after Esther was in the palace, Mordecai hovered and he was available to her. And that Esther continued to seek and consult the wisdom of Mordecai. He saw a need, he met a need, he exceeded a need. Church, we are declaring that Winnipeg belongs to Jesus. And we are going to need more Mordecai men and women to fulfill that. I am challenged this morning on how do I meet those needs that I see? Can I meet them? Can I exceed them? Do I have the eyes that say, God, let me see what I need to see for such a time as this? And then do I fulfill that? So Mordecai, wow. I also love how much he loved God's people. Who are God's people? All, right? All. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How am I showing up in this city loving people? How am I doing that? Mordecai fought. I mean, oh my gosh, guys. I mean, I've given you tons of spoilers already. Their job and their battle wasn't over once Haman was impaled. And that is a crazy irony, right? That Haman is impaled on the very stake that he had built for his enemy. Would we see that in our battles this morning? Can we see our enemies being impaled as we continue, like Mordecai, to stay the course, to fight from the ground into the air, that spiritual battle, to be faithful, that in the midst of a battle for our very lives, we show up, we roll up our sleeves and we go to work. Wow, that's Mordecai. He's pretty amazing guy. Esther's not too shabby either. She could have absolutely tried to hide. Absolutely. She could have used her position to garner her own safety. I like this thing about Esther. Esther comes into the palace. She is well established in the palace. And yet the Bible tells us she continued to not just consult Mordecai's wisdom, but she sought it out. Who are the men and women in our villages that we're consulting? Because we need us some Mordecais that won't just cheer us on, that's awesome, but that will also call us up and call us higher. We need the Mordecais in our life that will say, hey, you got an anointing, you got a calling on your life. You got a calling on your life for such a time as this. It's 2024, and there's a city that needs our love. And there's a God who is orchestrating for such a time as this. Are you up for it? Are you doing it? I love that Esther sought wise counsel. And she was so humble in how she handled this adversity. Wow, it's amazing. I'm just going to tell you that I love Brené Brown. She's amazing. She's one of my faves. I read lots of her books. It's great. But there's one area that I disagree with Brené. Brené would say that we are the heroes of our life. And I'm going to say that in the book of Esther, as in my life, as someone who loves Jesus, that God is the hero of my life, like he's the hero in our Esther story this morning. The conclusion that I want us to sit on for just a minute is that God is the hero in our lives and in our story. The book of Esther, these 10 chapters, does not once mention God by name. Crazy, right? And yet, he is palpable. You can feel him. He is all through. He's woven on every page, in every chapter, in every scene. God is so, so prevalent. He was working. He was working in them and through them and around them and for them, because God is for us. And God is for us today. And he is still working.